Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another of our Bookshop events here in the High Street Baptist Church. Can I welcome to the stage Jamie Fewery, our host, along with Mick Herron.
Good evening, everyone. Are we on? Have we got two mics? Oh, there's one there.
I think that's if this one doesn't work.
Oh, do you know what? I won't bother with that one then. I was just wired up 2 seconds ago and completely forgot about that. Thank you, Ben, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to see such a full hall for tonight's event. We're really privileged, and I'm really privileged, to be talking tonight to Mick Herron, who you will all know, I'm sure, from the tremendous Slough House novels, in books, and obviously the TV adaptation, which has done so well over the past couple of years. But tonight we are, and I'm sure there will be questions at the end where we can talk about those books. Tonight we're going to be talking about Mick's new book, or newest book, The Secret Hours, which is a kind of a standalone, I would say, potentially within the kind of extended universe of those other books, which I've just read, really enjoyed. It's got the kind of humour and gripping nature that you would always expect from one of Mick's books. So if you've not picked a cup of coffee yet, then by all means do so after the event. But I just thought first we'd hand over to Mick just to tell us a bit about the book, where it's come from, and the kind of story within there.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me? Is this on? Good. Yeah, The Secret Hours. It was written as a standalone, and I told my publisher it was a standalone, and I'd intended it to be one, but it sort of grew as I wrote it. I had an email not long ago from someone via my agent asking, had I known when I was writing Slow Horses, which I started writing back in 2008, had I known then what the plot of The Secret Hours was going to be? And I had to say, I didn't even know what the plot of The Secret Hours was going to be when I started writing The Secret Hours. So I don't really write to a grand plan. I'm much more, let's call it organic, because that sounds nicer than careless and haphazard writer. The Secret Hours literally started with the first sentence, which is the worst smell in the world is dead badger, which is something that my brother told me. He lives in Devon. I was staying with him in Devon, as I often do, and we were walking down the Green Lanes when he told me this, and I thought, that's good, I'm having that. So that's what I had. I had an opening sentence, and I had the Green Lanes. And I pondered that for a while, but pondering doesn't really get me very far when I'm writing. I don't find that I can, is that me? Is it going to be better if I use the, yep. Hello? Does that work now? With less feedback? Okay, great. Where was it? Yes, I don't get very far just kind of lying on my sofa staring at the ceiling and inventing stories. I can get a little way with that, but not very far. I find that writing itself is where I get more energy, creative energy from. It's a dynamic process for me. When I'm writing, I get ideas about what to do next. When I'm just thinking about it, I hit a brick wall quite quickly. So what I did when I finished writing the last novel, Bad Actors, and was starting to think about what I could do with this dead badger, was that I would write a short story and kind of piggyback on that. Write a short story, which is going to be a Christmas short story. It's called Standing by the Wall, and see if writing that story could kind of come up with other ideas at the same time. Multitasking, really. But what happened was that story ended up as a kind of gateway into the Secret Hours. I introduced, in the very last paragraph, I think, the notion of this committee called Monochrome, and a photograph that they get hold of. And The Secret Hours then became a story, apart from the opening bit, which is about a dead badger, of this committee called Monochrome, which has been set up by an outgoing, in all senses of the word, Prime Minister, to investigate the sins of the Secret Service. He's taking revenge, essentially, on a service that he feels didn't support him during his premiership. So these two civil servants Griselda and Malcolm, they're called, are appointed to run this committee with a panel made up of politicians and vague celebrities to examine what the Secret Service has done wrong. And they've been given total access to all the files of the Secret Service. But on day one, they found that although they technically have access to all these files, what they don't have is access to where the files are kept. So they're not allowed into Regent's Park, which is the imaginary centre of the Secret Service that I have in my novels. And what they have to do is they have to ask to see each file, and they have to quote the catalogue number of each file. And they've got no idea how the cataloguing system works. So they spend 2 years basically twiddling their thumbs and interviewing people who have access to Grind in one way or another, but they can't get anywhere. They have no files, no knowledge of what's really going on. And as so often happens in my books, they become very frustrated and feel thwarted in their careers and are generally quite unhappy people. This is where I get my kicks, writing about unhappy people. And then a file falls into their hands, and it's a real one, and it tells the story of something that happened in Berlin shortly after reunification in the early 90s. And they start investigating that, and that's really where the plot of The Secret Hours lies. But the badger comes into it as well.
I'm still on the radio. That's good to know. Reading the book, I recognised obviously a lot of humour in the book, and there's a lot of humour in your other books. I'm thinking of one of the most immediate examples comes to mind is the testimony of the cleaner at GCHQ, who's complaining about the state of the toilets to this panel that's investigating the sins of the service. How do you balance that? Are you conscious that you're trying to make readers laugh as well as become gripped by a story? And how do you balance that? It strikes me as a really hard thing to balance. You're injecting some kind of humour and almost like farce into some of these things, but you're also creating the story that really drags people along. That there's this monochrome inquiry. Is that a conscious balance, or just how you write?
Balance is a good word for it. I pay exactly the same amount of attention to the balance of those issues when I'm writing as I do to balance when I'm riding my bicycle. I remember the one time I really started thinking, how is this working, when I was riding a bicycle, and I fell off. And that was a lesson, really. Never, just go by intuition and trust that it will all work out nicely in the end, and that you'll get home without falling off the bike. And that's pretty much how I write the books. I just keep my fingers crossed and wear a high-vis jacket when I'm riding, and that seems to do it.
To wear a helmet at your desk. I'm genuinely surprised that you said you're not really an advanced plotter. Because again, writing books that involve elements of espionage and civil service skullduggery and those kind of things, it would seem to me that you have to really know where that story's going. Do you not even have an end in mind? Because I think of some of your novels, they package themselves up nicely towards the end. Do you know that kind of trajectory?
I generally have a destination, yes, but I don't have a map as to how to get there. I will know a few stations along the way, as it were. But the granular detail is something that comes out in the day-to-day writing, which I think is for me anyway the most effective way of doing it, because you can get bogged down in the detail, and I think that if over plotting a novel can lead to it feeling inert when you're writing it. It's basically like you've got a blueprint there and you're just trying to produce that onto paper. It can lose a lot of energy. It's like you've already done the work, you've already put all the creativity into it, and you're just doing your homework at the point where you're writing, and it shouldn't be like that.
Joining the dots.
And actually writing the act of putting sentences onto the page, that should be where all the energy lies. And if it does, then I think that readers pick that up.
I also think just reading a few of your books, that kind of enables you to avoid the trap that so many series books fall into, that each book just becomes a repeat of the last. I think of there's some authors where they have a yearly book and you kind of know exactly what it's going to be, whereas the Slough House ones and this all feel in and of themselves. You pick up any of them and read, they feel more organic for that.
So I'm getting away with it, is that what you're saying? That's quite a relief.
Just about. Just about. You mentioned, as you were talking about the book in the setup, that it was meant to be a standalone. I mentioned in the start as well, it kind of exists within what feels like an extended universe. Slough House, there are some familiar characters, and like Molly in the archives.
There are, but
Master
familiar
Wells.
characters appear, but under different names. There's a rule I established quite early that the committee, when interviewing anybody who has been involved in an intelligence operation, they have to use the work names of the characters involved. They're not allowed to use their real names. So there are some familiar characters from the Slough House series do appear in this book, but they're all called by different names.
First desk.
But you can possibly recognise one or two of them, depending on what they do.
And was there any temptation to bring this back into the rest of the, or were you very determined that this would stand on its own and not drift back into, a sudden appearance with Jackson Lamb or something like that?
I'm not going to make any comments about that, for fear of delivering spoilers.
Yeah, fair enough. And that world, the kind of Slough House world, the Secret Hours world, I'm going to guess you don't because of the way you write, but do you ever have that mapped out in your head, how far that extends, potential other standalones, say if the series were to come to a close, like what's next, and does it exist in that same sphere? Do you have that somewhere, or is it just all up there?
I don't have that, and it's always been a book at a time. I've never thought that far ahead. There was one novel where I decided to end it on a bit of a cliffhanger, and that wasn't because I knew what I was going to do next. I thought, if I do that, then I'm going to have to think really hard before I write the next one, because I'm going to have to work out what is going on there. So it wasn't part of a large plan. It was just a game I was playing with myself, really. I've got to the stage where now I'm thinking perhaps I ought to have some kind of end game in sight. What shape that will take, I don't really know. Well, I kind of do know, but I'm not telling anybody yet. So, but until now, I haven't been doing that.
Because always from the point of view of the reader, reading this and reading some of the other novels, it does feel kind of fleshed out. It does feel almost world building. I remember when I first read one of your books, I ended up, because I did a short period of time working in the civil service, not anything to do with the intelligence services, although would I tell you if I had.
I'm certainly not understanding it. So.
And I ended up Googling MI5 Regent's Park, because I was like, it just feels so well established that it must be real, and then obviously it's kind of your fictional. So it feels to me that things are worked out. So there's none of that. There's no kind of like Tolkien's map of this world and characters. I think of The Sopranos, where the writers wrote the entire backstory to the family. There's none of that exists anywhere. No,
there isn't. I did meet last year, I think it was, a former chief advisor to the government on intelligence issues. He was a kind of liaison officer between MI5, MI6 and number 10. And we were having dinner together, and we were talking about such matters. And I said, of course, Regent's Park is just something that I made up. And he said, oh, no, there is an office around there. But,
how is it?
But I had no idea that was true. Or even if it is true, he might have been making it up.
And you talked about playing games there. Is that something you do with yourself? Because there are twists and tricks in the book. So is that part of kind of surprising yourself through that organic act of writing? You're looking at where the story might take you, where you might wrong-foot the reader and lead them down a path and then subvert it.
There is a level at which it's all game playing, really, in one way or another. I mean, I am having fun doing this. At the same time, it is work, and it can be quite difficult at times. I mean, that's not where I carried away. It's not like working for the NHS or being in retail or anything. It's quite pleasant. But it can be, I can find myself not sure what to do next. And then it's a matter of kind of outthinking myself, really. Well, what would be a surprising thing to happen now? And if you've got an end in sight, then it's quite easy to produce the twists, because I'm not surprising myself with a twist. I start off with that, and you just kind of backtrack from there and work out how it can be hidden and then delivered as if it were a perfectly logical and coherent thing to do. So it's like if I were writing murder mysteries, I would know who the killer was right from the start. So that's a matter of obscuring your tracks as you go along. So it's a lot easier, in a sense, working backwards in that way. But often I like to say often that I'm only about a page and a half ahead of the reader at any given time. It's like being a teacher, and being ever so slightly ahead of the syllabus.
That's all you need to be, right? Let's talk about character development for a minute. So I think part of the reason your books have caught on so well among so many readers is the characters. People are so drawn to, be it Jackson Lamb or Min Harper, one of the other characters in those novels. Within this one, again, talking from experience of working in the civil service for a short amount of time, they felt very real. Malcolm Carr felt very real in that kind of frustrated civil servant who worries about his future after this, whether he's going to be kind of stuck in a cupboard somewhere in Sunderland or something like that, in Griselda as well. What kind of research do you go through to build these characters and create kind of fully realised people on the page?
It isn't really research. Research doesn't come into it. It is all about character. The old adage that all young writers get told, write what you know. I mean, it's kind of a tricky. It's a much trickier concept than it sounds like. But I suppose in a way I've been doing that all through my writing career. And what I know is what it's like working in an office, and that's what I've taken it from. Extrapolated that and said, well, if I were working in an office, but for the Secret Service or for the Civil Service or anything else, and it all comes down to people having their own petty little agendas and wondering who's stealing their milk from the fridge, that kind of thing. That presumably goes on in MI5 the same way it goes on in any other office book.
Startlingly accurate. One of my main memories from working in it was everybody was so paranoid about milk that everyone would buy their own milk bottle for the week because the government didn't provide it. And at the end of the week, you would just have 35 gone-off bottles of milk in the fridge. And the answer to who was stealing the milk was me, because I refused to be involved in this system and just, have a bit from that one, a bit from that one, as the day went on. But it's absolutely right. I think they're almost novels about work, but the work just happens to be in this kind of high-stakes area. That kind of brings me on to a question I wanted to ask about outsiders. And it feels like in all your books, the central characters are outsiders. They've been pushed to the margins of where they are, whether through error in some of the Slough House novels, whether they've been set up on what initially feels like a doomed inquiry in this novel. Do you think, had you been in that world of the Secret Service or the government, or would you have been able to write in the same way? Do you think you have to be an outsider to write these outsiders?
I'm not really sure. I don't think of myself as an outsider. And when I'm thinking about these characters, I'm mostly thinking about them as being, if not failures, at least people who regard themselves as failures, and people who have been thwarted in one way or another in the career that they thought they deserved. And I sympathise with that a great deal. And that's really the angle that I'm taking on them. And I started writing this series at a time. Slough Horses was my 6th novel, I think. I won't count them up now, but I think it was my 6th. And at that point in my career, I'd accepted that I wasn't going to be a bestseller, and that the best I could hope for was to be published, and I'd see my books in libraries occasionally, but they weren't making it onto bookshelves of bookshops, and they weren't by and large being paperbacked by then either. So I'd accommodated myself to that. Like, I'm doing this because it fulfills me. It's what I want to do. I need to write. And the books are on my shelf, even if they're not on anybody else's. And that was fine. But at the same time, I think some of that must have fed into the original concept for coming up with Slough Horses. They're writing about these people who had wanted to be, James Bond, and instead they're stuck in a dismal office doing very mundane, very boring tasks. And I had a day job in not a dismal office, and the tasks weren't necessarily that boring. I was quite enjoying it, but there were certain parallels there, which only came clear to me a couple of years later. To be honest, I wasn't thinking about it at the time. So it wasn't the sense of being an outsider; it was the sense of perhaps being inside something I didn't particularly want to be inside of, and I don't know, underachievement or disappointment. I mean, these kinds of feelings that fed into it. I'm a big reader of verse. I read a lot of poetry, and Larkin has always been one of my favourite poets. And a lot of that kind of, the feeling of disappointment, he's the great poet of disappointment, and a lot of that kind of feeling seeps into the books, I think. And that's where I find, I don't really like the word inspiration, but where I find that kind of sources of the sort of things I write about.
These people are also quite determined as well, aren't they?
Well, that was it. I mean, they are all, if not necessarily alphas, they're all wannabe alphas, and they all regard themselves as alpha types, and therefore they can't stand the fact that they have failed. I mean, for River Cartwright, who thinks he's the hero of the whole series, because he was there on page 1, and no matter what I do to him, he always thinks he's the hero. I mean, he imagined this life for him. He thought it was his birthright, because, you know, apart from anything else, he had a grandfather who was in the intelligence service. So he can't really believe what's happened to him and isn't going to accept it, or hasn't yet anyway. And it feels to me that that is what these characters would do. I mean, there's occasionally the odd burnout who will just think, yeah, whatever, I'll take my take whatever they throw at me and just hang on until my pension kicks in, which is essentially what Jackson Lamb is doing. But I took in mind, I remember reading an interview with an actor who'd worked with Mike Leigh, and had been told, he was a very, very good character actor, but was told he was going to be the star of this Mike Leigh film. It was the first time he'd have been a headliner. And Leigh makes his films through a lot of improvisation, and he gets the actors to come up with their own backstories, and a lot of the dialogue is improvised, I think. I mean, the situations are worked out, and then they act and just make up the words as they go along. And this guy loved it because he was going to be the star. And Leigh shoots an awful lot of material and then goes away and edits it. And it was only when he saw the final film that he realised he's only in a couple of scenes. He had thought he was going to be the hero, and it turns out he wasn't. But of course, in those scenes that he's in, he gives it everything because, you know, this is his starring role, and he believes he's the star and the hero of the film. And only when it was over did he find out he wasn't. So that's the kind of thing that my characters are like. They all think that they're the main character in the story.
Yeah.
And they don't really realise that, in fact, they're part of a whole bunch of people,
There's
none of whom are heroes.
There's always that glimmer of a way back as well. They're always thinking of. I was looking a bit on the train. I folded down a page for it. It was the moment when Malcolm decides to open the envelope and that kind of thing. And there's that again, that meek civil servant decides, I'm going to go for it. I'm not going to accept my lot with this one. And then there's that kind of determination to change their lot, even if the odds are so unbelievably stacked against them, because the odds are the state. Yeah,
he's just feeling very, very put upon, and this is his way of kicking back, really. Yeah. I mean, he does it in a state of petulance, not wannabe heroism, to be honest, but it has the same effect in the end.
It's interesting. And talking about some of the other characters in this, I mean, reading this book, it felt, you may disagree, but to me as a reader, it felt slightly more overtly political than some of your other books, and it references quite a lot of real life recent events, Partygate, COVID, all those kind of things. To the point where sometimes it almost verges on kind of satire of government and the absurdly bureaucratic inside-out processes they go through to hide things and keep things under wraps. And you talked about, you know, First Desk giving them access to all the files, but not the coding system for the file. And was that a kind of, is that how you see this book? Slightly more political as a standalone, slightly more satirical, pushing against things a little bit?
I think the Slough House series generally has been heading in that sort of direction since London Rules, which I wrote in 2016, and for some reason that year made me think this is about time we started writing more about politics. And you know, the current government, the governments over the past decade, really, I mean, say what you like about them, but for a novelist, they're the gift that keeps on giving, aren't they? So when I was writing this, and I mean, a lot of the Partygate stuff was basically happening as fast as I was writing it down. It was impossible to ignore. I've taken, for the past, 8 or 9 years, a bit longer than that really, whatever the state of the government is at the time I'm writing the book, that feeds into the book. So although the characters are all invented, and essentially the world I'm writing about is largely invented, but it's set against a backdrop of reality. So that's another one of those balances, I suppose. So yes, there's a lot of the Partygate stuff feeds into this. because it felt unignorable, really, when I'm writing about government and the misuse of power and various kinds of abuse. I mean, that was a very, very obvious and very real one.
And cover-ups and all that kind of thing.
Cover-ups. I mean, we got so used to this over the past few years, particularly during the Johnson government, I think, that there's a danger that we just start taking it for granted. And I felt that, it ought to be, it's something we should be angry about.
Well, and I suppose you mentioned it earlier, but that almost level of spite against the Secret Services in this case, that they wanted to find out something, but the politicians would push back against them, trying to cause their downfall, trying to pick holes in them. So they didn't uncover things. So that your kind of way of making your feelings known about these things as well.
I guess, and I also did think it's kind of funny as well, to be honest.
Have you thought about how you might address that? I mean, not to get too far into politics, but the realistic prospect of a change of government.
Yeah.
Have you thought about how you might deal with the potential incoming lot? I mean, obviously they're not going to be white.
Oh, I'm going to give up. I have great faith in the notion that whoever is in government, things are going to go wrong. I've been right so far. I can't imagine that we'll reach a state where there's nothing to be either angry or satirical about, regardless of who is in the driving seat. There are some things I kind of regret over the past few years. I've been asked lately whether I'll be writing about Liz Truss as government. But I don't write many short stories, so I don't feel like there's enough of a target there for me to set on, which is a bit of a shame, I think, in many ways. Yeah, I mean, the book I'm writing now won't be out until after the next election, so I'm having to be aware of that.
Yeah.
And I think I am, although if the election goes in an unexpected direction, I might have to rewrite most of the book.
And the politicians themselves, I'm sure I'm not alone, but every time I read one of the people you're writing about as a politician, whether it's a slightly dodgy Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary or a Prime Minister, there are a few consistent people that come into my head that would sort of fit the bill of like dodgy, corrupt, vain politicians. And like, is the Prime Minister in this party, the previous Prime Minister, is that Boris? It seems to be, and it's in previous books as well, where you mentioned like a Foreign Secretary who's after a photo shoot but has been kicked out for lying or something like that. Are your politicians caricatures, or is there a direct line into some of the people that run
a lot of what I do is drawn from what's going on, but it's an amalgam, if you like, of various different people. I mean, when I first invented the character Peter Judd back in Slough Horses, I intended him to be a kind of montage of all the worst kind of politician you could possibly have. And I gave him a lot of characteristics borrowed from various people who were politicians, leading politicians at the time. And for some reason, everybody thinks it's Boris Johnson. I don't know why. I mean, you bring together all the worst possible characteristics you could have in a prime minister, and he's the first person that comes to mind. It's extraordinary, isn't it? There was a passage in The Secret Hours quite near the beginning where I was setting the political backdrop to what was going to follow. And I was writing this, God, I can't even remember which year it was. It must have been early 21. And I had to rewrite, over the course of 3 or 4 months, I had to rewrite that passage over and over again. And eventually I just thought, you know what, I'm going to come back to this when I finish the book and do it then, because everything was changing so quickly, and the key figures in Parliament, in the government, were changing overnight often, that it was impossible to pin down. It was like nailing jelly to a wall. So occasionally the attempt to be current can be quite difficult, and particularly in febrile times like we've been undergoing.
Yeah, when it changes every 5 minutes, it's quite hard to pick up, I suppose, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of fun to watch it all happening, but it wasn't. Well, it didn't make my job any easier, I have to say.
No, I mean, I always think this was a great TV, but to live in it must be tricky. I mean, obviously the title, The Secret Out, strikes me that one of the overriding themes of this book is what people say they do and what they purport to do, and what they're doing slightly under the cover. And it kind of feels like it's lifting a lid on that a little bit. And I don't know, I was having a look back through the book on the train over and just pulling out a couple of bits. Is there a hero to this book? You know, in Slough House you have a great anti-hero in Jackson Lamb. Is there someone in this book who is like the moral centre ground?
I think it shifts, really. I mean, I think in many ways Malcolm might be, although he's a fairly petulant and not necessarily likable character. He's got strange ideas about himself. But it's what he does, the way he and Griselda as well, the way they decide to do what they do, that makes them the moral centre, I think. And with Malcolm, I feel that give him another 10 years and he might turn out to be quite a decent person. He's just not got there yet. You know? So, I don't know. I mean, I like writing about people behaving badly, essentially. And because of the kind of world I'm writing about, all these people have secrets. And the notion of secret identities is one that looms large over this book, partly because of the fun I'm having of smuggling characters in, but also that the very nature of the work they're doing means that they have to adopt other identities in order to do their jobs. And so that makes it difficult to pin down a moral centre, really. How can somebody be the moral centre when they're lying about who they are? You know, that pulls the rug out right from the start.
And I suppose with all your books, I was, again, just something observational as I've been looking at a few of them over the past couple of weeks. The voice doesn't stay consistent with one person as you go through. You hop in between people's perspectives.
Oh yes, I like doing that, yeah.
And that, I suppose, adds to that thing that there is no kind of moral centre. There's no hero. Because no one has kind of outsized perspective on these things, apart from probably Jackson in the Slough House novels. But in this, everyone kind of gets a say. So you're not heroing one single person's perspective and view of a situation which is complex.
Yeah, I like giving them all their own points of view and staying with them. It's one of the things you're not supposed to do is change points of consciousnness during a scene, or you know, it's supposed to be a wrong thing to do, and it can be if it's done badly. But I like swapping it a lot. I've done it in the middle of a sentence before. I like seeing how often I can do it in the course of a book. In Bad Actors, I have a scene which was the middle section of that. It's about 20,000 words long, I think, and it's one unbroken stream of prose. There are no line breaks, no chapter breaks or anything, but the centre of consciousness goes all the way through the cast of Slough House, from one character to another. And I loved doing that. I thought it was great fun to do. And I don't know whether readers notice it especially, but ideally they won't. Ideally it will be one seamless piece of prose, but it's technically breaking all these rules that you're supposed to.
I think editors notice it. Editors notice it.
The editors at this stage know that I do it deliberately, so they don't try to tell me that I've made a mistake there.
I remember I did it once in a book, and the copy editor, I think it, you know, gave them a bit of a breakdown. They kept adding loads of line breaks. No, who's talking here? Who's talking here? So you're right. It is a very tricky thing to do. But I do think it possibly adds to the kind of televisual quality of things as well. In television, we very rarely get a single person's perspective on an entire situation. We get multiple perspectives, and in your books, you always see things from lots and lots of different angles. And potentially help the TV adaptation of Slow Horses, which has obviously become so successful as well. How much time we've got? Oh, we've got a little while longer. To just touch on a lot of people here will have read the Slow Horses novels. We talked a little bit about Secret Hours, but just to touch on those a little bit, because we've got one of them up here as well. Can you pinpoint the moment that Jackson Lamb came to you?
I can't really, and I do remember writing the very first scene in which he appears, which is in Slow Horses, of course. I do remember writing that. And I remember all I'd known about him up to that point was that he was going to be a bit of an ogre. And initially, I think I hadn't been going to have him in the books at all. He'd be, a presence at the top of the stairs that everybody was aware of and talked about all the time, but he wouldn't actually appear. But that wasn't really going to work, I decided. So he first appears when River Cartwright is in his office examining the contents of a bin bag that he's just stolen. And I knew that Lamb was going to be big and noisy and very much a kind of figure that everybody would be aware of when he was around. And yet when I was writing the scene, he appears in the doorway without River realising he's come in at all, and he just appears there. And I didn't sort of plan that, I just found myself writing it, and I thought, well, this actually could be quite interesting. That's quite a contradiction already. And it just kind of grew from there. I realised that I could keep loading onto him all these different kinds of habits and abilities that were very much at odds with his appearance and his general demeanour. So he became cleverer, I think, than I'd expected him to be. And he quite quickly became a lot ruder than I thought he was going to be, and a lot more unpleasant. And I realised quite quickly that the best way of dealing with him was to keep him at arm's length. So that might happen a little bit in the first 2 books. By the time I got to the 3rd book, I think I was clear that although we talked about entering the heads of all the other characters, I never go into Lamb's head. You don't know what he thinks or what he feels. You just know what he says and what he does. And the reason for that is that if the reader, and if I was inside his head, then it would become apparent either that he doesn't mean the stuff he says, or that he does mean it. And if he means it, he's completely intolerable. Nobody could have any sympathy with him at all. He would be a monster. And if he doesn't mean it, then he loses, the edge that he might otherwise have. So I keep him at a distance for that reason.
It's really interesting because as a reader, I was never conscious of that change happening across the books. I think I just accept, and potentially it's because you get to know the cast around him so well that you so easily fit into their narratives and you understand their kind of journeys. That I was not conscious that I wasn't getting his internal perspective anymore.
I never spent very long with him in those first 2 books, but I think there are moments where it might happen.
And he wasn't kind of percolating for a while as a character in your head. There was no kind of sitting around for a while thinking, this might be something. I might have to give this one a go.
I don't think so. I mean, as I said before, most of the creativity happens, at the typeface, as it were. It's when I'm actually doing the writing. So I didn't plan any of the characters out in great detail beforehand. I just put them on the page and then worked out who they were, what they sounded like, what they'd done, and what they were going to do. So again, that word organic is one that I rely on because it seems to fit the nearest into how that particular part of the process works.
And a lot of writers, they do kind of, if you went to a creative writing seminar, they would tell you to write portraits of your characters, write about who they are, their motivations, their entire backstory, what they like, what they don't like, how they speak, their tone of voice, all those kind of things. Did you do that for this book? Have you done it for any of your books? Or as you say, does it all kind of come out in the moment while you're working?
There's very little. I think I did a bit of that for Slough Horses, largely just because I wanted to see how many characters there were going to be when I was inventing the department. So there's a little bit, but almost none of it is particularly. It all seems quite anonymous when looking at the notes, which I did not that long ago. In fact, look at the notes that I'd originally made. I wasn't necessarily sure that I could attach them to any particular character. It's only when they start talking to each other that I found the characters start to become identifiable and individual. So those are the scenes that I like to involve a new character in as quickly as possible. Once they meet Roddy Ho, and they're responding to him, then I know what they're going to be like.
People reveal themselves through dialogue, I suppose. And that's what I think in this book as well. You have a lowly civil servant who's meant to be the kind of assistant doing the shorthand. And then you have the people, I think of the scene when he accosts, is it Margaret, outside the Savoy. And then there's that kind of, she's having her breakfast. And through the dialogue, you really establish that he's not meant to be in her sphere. She doesn't want him anywhere. They're not meant to be in the same place. And even the conversations with First Desk as well. They very quickly establish through dialogue that these people exist in separate spheres of this.
And hierarchies and bureaucracies, yes, I'm quite interested in the way they work.
And within Slough House as well, the way that, just talking about River Cartwright, he's very confident in his manner and its expression. Jackson Lamb is very almost distant, diffident. He's not really bothered about it, or he purports to not really be bothered about these people. Some people are trying hard to find their way back into the service. Roddy Ho thinks he's a genius that's been put somewhere because he's too good to be where he normally is. And these things all come out as they talk to each other and they interact.
I hope so. That's certainly the aim.
Just looking at the time, I just wondered if there are any questions from the floor. I'll just take a couple now and then we'll go back to it because there's quite a lot of people in the room. You've got two on there as well, have you? Have we got roaming mics? We've got
one roaming mic, so let's take ground floor questions first. We'll do, say, 3 of those, and then we'll go upstairs.
Hi, I'm Mick.
Hiya.
Hello. Was The Secret Hours a bit more easy to write than your other novels, or was it a bit more difficult?
They all go through different stages. There are always bits where writing a novel where it feels like I made a mistake somewhere and should have been, a fireman or something. And other times where it seems to go quite easily. This one, it started off quite nicely, in fact. I quite enjoyed doing something a bit different. And then became a bit torture in places. Overall, it was one of the most fun to write, I have to say. And I don't know whether that was because I was writing about new characters, which sometimes is great fun, sometimes can be more difficult, or whether it was because I knew I was writing about old characters, but they were pretending to be new ones. That was quite fun. The bits that I thought would be most difficult to write in this book turned out not to be. The long sections which are set in Berlin in the 90s, which I thought would require more work than I'm used to doing. I realised that I could get away with doing very little research, indeed, which is very important to me. And they were written really quite swiftly for me, which surprised me. I hadn't been expecting it.
how much research, that was a question I was going to ask actually before we threw it open. Thinking about the book with cicadas and then this one with Berlin, are you really immersed in that world, like reading? I mean, the comparison that gets put on the front covers, obviously, a lot of the time is this generation's Le Carre and those kind of things. Obviously, he was in the service and well immersed in that world, and you're not. Do you find? Have you read everything in the genre? Do you read lots of history, or do you just enough?
Just enough is probably the right answer. I mean, I've been a reader of Le Carre for a long time, and I've drawn from his work a lot. Mostly the kind of lessons that he that are exemplified by his work, in as much as you can invent your own language. I mean, a lot of the language that he invented for his Secret Service, some of it was apparently taken from life. These are lamplighter's and things like that. Some of them were terms that he was taking from the service. Others he was just making up, but it sounded like they were real. And that was useful. It's a useful thing to know that you can do that. A lot of writing about the espionage, the covert world, is just making it sound like you know what you're talking about. And you can get away with that if you're lucky. Some spy writers, go off and have a career in the CIA or whatever for 20 years and then come out of it and start writing books. I couldn't be bothered to do that.
I wonder if that makes them less readable, because it's the first rule of writing, show, don't tell, isn't it? Where if you show a world and you say this is the world, rather than explaining how many things you know about it.
I'm sure we've all read books which have detail that we weren't remotely interested in, get on with the story.
Yes.
That's not limited to people who worked in the Secret Service by any means. It's always something you have to be aware of. Don't put an info dump in the book. I avoid this by having very little information at my disposal and just do the makeup.
I think it helps, particularly in this kind of book where you're writing almost about bureaucracy and cover-ups and paperwork, but it becomes a thriller almost as well. You're kind of being brought along by a story that's really compelling.
But again, glad I'm getting away with this.
Yeah. Next question from the floor. We'll go over here, and then there's two up this way as well.
It's not always obvious in your books that the Secret Service is acting in the public interest, I would say. But there's something about the end of this book which I loved, and I know there's no spoilers, but I found myself for the first time admiring First Desk more than I loathed her. And I don't know whether that's a tension that you expect us to feel, or whether you share about the value or the damage that, that can be done on the Secret Service.
She's a character that's interested me more and more as the series has gone on. And I've always felt that although she's somebody who she does a lot of very bad things, but she tends to do them for the right reasons, or at least reasons she thinks are right. A lot of her machinations in the earlier novels are about her attempting to get to the position where she is now as First Desk, because she thinks she's the best person for the job. And so do I. I think she is the best person to be doing that job, even though she's not a very nice person. I think it probably takes a not very nice person to be able to do what she does effectively. And it is true that I do, the intelligence services do come off quite badly in my books. And I do feel that that's not the whole story by any means. I mean, you know, you pick up the papers this past weekend, there's plenty about bad things that the service has got up to. But you never pick up a newspaper and find out all the great stuff that they've done, which means nothing bad happened this week. I mean, there's a sense in which you can say every day we go by that a train isn't blown up, you know, that we all travel on the underground safely. That's a success. That's they're doing their job and they're keeping us safe. So, and this is something that has been, I mean, it's right there in Slough Horses, the very first one. She's railing against that. She does a very bad thing because she wants to draw attention to the fact that they never get any of the credit for keeping us safe and are undervalued as a result. So yes, it's something that I am aware of. And in her particular case, a particular instance of that character, she's someone that I mean, she's always been a strong presence in the books, I think, but in the Secret Hours, I very much enjoyed doing what I did at the end. I thought it was time for her to have a proper moment, I thought.
There's one at the front row. But let me throw a question whilst you're handing the mic there. So Catherine asks a really good question. It's less of a statement more than a question. We'd love to get a glimpse of Jackson's backstory. He was once a Joe, and his past has made him the horror show comedy genius he now is. Please write this story.
I'll bear that in mind. It's a difficult question to answer, but The Secret Hours is out in paperback now, if she's interested in reading that.
A quick question. Now the TV series has come out, which is absolutely fantastic. How much time are you getting to write, or are you having to find yourself balancing between kind of adapting your books with a script? And I know some previous franchises, when they've gone to TV, the author tends to get more involved in the TV side rather than kind of writing their own material or new material. So I just wondering how are you balancing that?
It is very true that we lose some writers, or seem to lose them for quite a long time. That's happened a lot in the States with writers like George Pelecanos and Dennis Lehane going off to write for HBO for years on end. I'm not writing scripts, and although I am involved in the TV production, and in the writer's room a bit, discussing the scripts before they're written. It doesn't take up that much time. I will, generally speaking, writer's room will run for about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and I will be there for maybe 3 days during that time. So it's not really, and I'm finding it great fun. I thought it would be really difficult for me. I thought I'd be sitting in a corner with my arms folded, sulking and saying, it's not supposed to be like that, stop it. Because I've never worked collaboratively, creatively speaking, I've never worked collaboratively before. And being a novelist, as people will no doubt know, is mostly about being by yourself, ideally in a room or by yourself, and doing whatever you like with nobody telling you anything at all. No instructions involved. So I thought I might find it difficult having that turned on its head and being part of a team and knowing that there were other people who would be able to say yes or no about what was going on. But I've had great fun doing it, and largely because the rest of the people involved, the other writers and those parts of the production staff who are there in the writers' room, are all really committed to putting the books onto the screen, and it's the feel and tone of the books and the characters that they want to preserve. I think they've done a very good job of doing that. I'm sure we've all seen TV series based on books that we know and love that we think are complete travesties, and also that make you wonder, why on earth did they do that to the book? Why didn't they? It seems to have so little in common with the source material. You wonder why they gave it the same title or have the characters have the same names, because they don't bear any resemblance to the characters that we know and love in our heads. So that didn't happen, which I'm very glad to say. And although it has taken up some time, it hasn't really, I don't think, intruded on the writing time that I have. And I've always come out of the room feeling quite energized, feeling like I want to get back to these characters and carry on working with them so that there's more material there.
Has the process influenced you? Obviously, seeing Jackson played so brilliantly, has that, or the writers from experience working collaboratively, has that influenced the future trajectory of the books at all?
Not consciously. I mean, almost certainly it will have done one way or another. But I don't see the actors, by and large, I don't see the actors in my head when I'm writing now. But I've never really had images of the characters anyway. I don't have a visual imagination particularly. I'm very much writing to the page, and it's vocabulary that I'm interested in and lyrical images. So to that extent, it hasn't changed at all. Having said that, I mean, I look at the characters on screen and think that they're doing a brilliant job of being just what they should be. They do seem to be embodying the characters.
I think it's so well that I'm not particularly, I don't visualize things when I read, but certainly since I've seen the adaptations, when I read Jackson, I hear it in Gary Oldman's voice, and then when I heard First Desk, it was in that voice. So it has kind of, for the first time ever in my life, infiltrated my thinking in some way about when I read books.
When the casting was first done and was announced, I learned that Gary Oldman was going to be playing Lamb. I thought that's going to be very, very interesting. That's going to be could potentially be quite special. But when I heard that Christian Scott Thomas was playing First Desk, I was like, yes, absolutely. To be fair, if they'd said that she was going to play Roddy Ho, I would have thought, fine, I'm fine with that. But it is.
Actually, he's the other one where when I read the books now, it's that voice that comes through, and that's very rare for me that's ever happened. So I suppose it's a testament to their brilliant casting and how well played people.
I think the whole cast are doing a splendid job. I say I don't have much of a visual imagination, but the one character that I did have quite a strong image in my head of was River Cartwright, and Jack Loudon is just him. I mean, he's absolutely nailed it. It's fantastic.
Yeah. More questions? Have we got?
Any
I'm
questions
looking
up on
some very, very bright lights. So,
any questions on the balcony? I can see them. There is one up there. So whilst Leanne, if you go to the right-hand staircase, I'll throw in a question. I think it's a similar topic you've just been discussing. Actually, were you pleased with the choice of actors and the storyline within the TV drama Slow Horses? Did you have any input with the scripts? I mean, you've kind of answered that slightly, but do you want to extrapolate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, most of what happens in the first stages of writing the scripts it's a matter of working out how to put the story on screen. And most novels, and certainly mine, as we've discussed, have a lot of interiority, and that's what they depend on. So a lot of the time when you're reading the book, you're finding out what a character is feeling and what a character is thinking. And you can't necessarily put that on the screen very easily. So a lot of the initial adaptation process involves just solving problems like that. How do we convey this particular mood, this motivation to the audience? And these are the things we discuss, and I enjoy that. I find it quite good. It's quite a good process because it's not something that I need to think about when I'm writing it in prose, but it's something that you have to think about when thinking about how it will work on screen. I had thought that it would all be kind of diminution. You would lose stuff going to be losing all of Catherine's thoughts about her struggles with the bottle and so on. And what I hadn't really realised until the initial part of the process was all over and I was seeing it on screen was how much you can also gain, because you can put a camera on Saskia Reeve's face for about 4 seconds and she will tell you an awful lot just with the expression on her face. So that, the extent to which actors are bringing stuff to the part was something that I hadn't taken on board at all. I have a new respect for what they do. But as I say, it's a brilliant cast. These are very, very talented actors I'm working with.
Up the top.
At the top.
Hi, good evening, Mick. Hello. Mick, thanks for starting off and telling me about badgers and cycling, because I currently ride to work from home, and there's a dead badger on the road right next to me. I'm waiting for it now to explode, and my vomit-inducing ride to work will be complete. So thanks for that. You've really made my next month. I seem to have read quite a few of your books. I wanted to thank you for doing a standalone book, because it means that the order that I've read the other ones is now, irrelevant. I can read one book. Do you need to read your books in order? Because I haven't, and dead people keep on returning, so I get confused. Tell me, what do I need to do?
I'm sorry, I missed that last bit.
What do you need to do? Do you need to read them in order, or can they free fall?
I think we've got some very nice new editions of them. If you buy all of them, and then just choose your favourite colour and read that one and work your way through them in that way. As with any series, if you read them in the order that they're written, there's probably an underlying sense there that you wouldn't get otherwise, because you're finding things out at the same rate I am. And because occasionally characters will make a hard exit from my series, if you read the books in the wrong order, you might find yourself wondering either where did they come from, or where have they gone, depending. You mentioned avoiding spoilers earlier. I was in Belfast not long ago, and we were going through the question stage, and somebody stood up and said, you have a habit of killing off characters, don't you? How do you, why do you do that? And I was about to answer this because it's a question I've been asked quite often. And she took a deep breath and she said, you killed X and Y. And then she started reading a list of characters who died. And everybody was shouting at her. I was with Steve Kavanagh, the thriller writer. He was interviewing me, and he got really stroppy about it. So thank you for avoiding spoilers. So if you read the books in the right order, you avoid any of those unintentional spoilers, I guess. Yeah. But as I say, buy all of them and do what you like, really.
Is there another one up there?
There's another one
while
up
we're
there.
here.
Hi, just want to ask, because you say you don't plot in the beginning, I was wondering if you do a sort of reverse plotting, because lots of things happen sort of all over the place, whether you do something to keep tabs on what your characters have been up to, so that you don't get any crossing in various new books like this one or whatever.
I often have to stop and go back and look at earlier books just to remind myself who did what and where they're at now, as it were. In terms of the actual books, there are times where I will write in one particular thread of the story continuously, but when it appears in the book, it will be chopped up and there'll be other things happening in between. So it's all just a kind of editing process. I remember quite a few years ago getting quite a way into a book with a fairly minor character who was one of the bureaucrats that I use in the service. And for some reason, I looked back at an earlier book and realised that although I hadn't killed him off, I'd very definitively written him out of the series earlier. So I had to use one of these. I mean, you will perhaps recognise this as a writer's trick. I won't explain it all for the sort of layman, but it's called changing a character's name.
Right, yes.
I won't go into details of what it involves, because technically it's quite complicated, but it did solve an awful lot of those problems, I found. Yeah.
Right, I think Ben just gave me the sign we've come up to time. So I think all that remains left to say is to thank Mick for coming to Tring to see us this evening. So let's give a big round of applause to Mick.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you all.
And a massive thanks to Jamie Fewery for interviewing today as well.
Books
So
available.
you've all received, those of you who've got the books have got signed books. Mick is gonna now be signing again, but doing any dedications you may want. Obviously there will be a bit of a queue. The shop is also open, so if you want to top up your Slough House collection, we've got plenty of the first one as it happens, so as well. So do fill your books. Can I just give a quick shout out to the next event? We've got Alan Johnson MP, former MP, coming up next. Harriet Tyson, Alex Michaelides, a couple of great thriller writers in the shop. Emily Howes and Kate Murray Brown doing another event in the shop. Samuel Burr, The Fellowship of Puzzle Makers, which is one of the hottest debut novels of the year. And an evening with Richard Coles, Reverend Richard Coles is coming up. And I'm just confirmed Irvin Welsh is coming in July. So we've got a few crackers, haven't we? So thank you once again for coming.
Thank you.